Today I'm going to make my family recipe of a stone ground whole wheat old country bread. Welcome back to Comfort Food Farms, the plant-based home cooking channel. If this is your first time, I'm Kari Greger. I'm glad you've joined us. Let's get into it. First thing you're going to notice is that I am doubling the recipe. I'm going to be making 4 loaves of bread instead of 2. I have half a cup of water and 1 teaspoon of sugar. Whisk that together, and the water should be lukewarm, like bath temperature. This is the yeast. We're going to activate the yeast. Add the yeast to the lukewarm water and the dissolved sugar and stir it in. 3 tablespoons of yeast. Just make sure that the yeast is all stirred in. It will dissolve itself and then it will really start bubbling up. I'm using hard red spring wheat berries. So this is a whole grain, a whole wheat product. You will need 5 cups of wheat berries. Usually the natural grocers have a wheat mill, a flour mill at the store. I have my own flour mill. It has a nice chute where the wheat goes in, and I can adjust the size of the flour milled. It can go from cracked wheat right down to a real fine flour. And then the wheat goes through the chute, through the stones. It has self-dressing stones in it, and comes out in the drawer in the bottom as flour. The yeast has risen up, over double. This is 4 times the size, so our yeast is nicely activated. To the yeast mixture, I am going to add 1 tablespoon of ground flax soaked in 3 tablespoons of warm water. I have 1/3 cup of molasses. This gives such a nice flavor to the brown bread. This is optional. 2 teaspoons of vegetable oil. Now I'm going to add the rest of the water. 2.5 cups of warm water. Let's just blend that all together. There is salt to taste in this recipe. And you can add extra sugar if you want it a little sweeter. It's up to you. Remember, when you make it yourself, you have total control over the fat, salt, and sugar. Now, I did put some oil in, and that's because, in my experience, the oil wards off freezer burn. So I recommend adding the oil only if you want to freeze the bread. You do not need it otherwise. Is that good information? Give me a thumbs up below. Subscribe and hit the bell so you know when another recipe is posted. Blending in the flour. I'm adding in 2 or 3 cups of flour to begin with. I'm putting in the salt. 2 teaspoons of salt. I like to add it after a lot of the ingredients have gone in because I don't want it ruining the yeast growth. Next, I've got 3/4 of a cup of wheat gluten. And that is because the whole wheat is a very heavy flour. And we have gotten used to the light, fluffy loaves of white bread. Gluten is a stretchy and strong protein. There is gluten in the whole wheat flour, but the weight of the flour pops the yeast bubbles and flattens the bread, making the loaves very dense. The only time I didn't have to add gluten was when I was living at a high altitude in Banff, Alberta, Canada. Lighter air density allows the existing gluten to keep the bubbles the yeast produces. The closer to sea level, the more gluten is required to get the soft, light loaves. If you don't care about the density of the bread, don't add the gluten. Just add more whole wheat flour to make up the difference. If you're blending by hand, I would sift some of the whole wheat flour with the gluten because that'll be easier to mix in and you'll get a smoother dough. I just keep adding more flour until it starts pulling away from the sides and we get a bread dough looking mixture. Now, remember, I have doubled the recipe, so I'm making 4 loaves. 4 loaves is about all my mixer can handle. Actually, it has trouble. So I mix in the most of the flour, get it so it's moving as one piece of dough, and then I let the mixer go for 10 minutes. This is going to cut out one of the rising processes, one of the proofing. We don't have to do that with this bread because it gets mixed for 10 minutes. You can do this by hand. Just keep blending and mixing, and you don't have to let it rise, one rise before you put it into the loaf pans. We want to give the gluten time to dissolve and develop, and that usually takes about 10 minutes with the mixer. So while I'm letting the mixer blend the dough so the gluten develops, I'm going to spray some cooking spray on these bread loaf tins. I've wondered if this wouldn't just work with water. I'm thinking I'd like to try that the next time. I've just never even thought of doing it without the cooking spray, because I dust it with the whole wheat flour so that you get this nice coating. And I'm betting that spraying with just water would work just as well, because the flour dusted on the surface is going to keep the bread from sticking to the sides of the bread pan. The mixer has been going for about 10 minutes. I have gotten a nicely developed gluten. You can see it's stretchy, it's cleaning off the sides. Now I'm going to add more flour, and I sometimes work it in by hand until it is a little bit sticky, but not really sticking to my hands. You'll get to know the difference. I mean, once you've done this a couple of times. I don't want the bread to be heavy. I don't want to work in too much flour, but at the same time, we don't want the bread to be too wet. So there's kind of a fine point of finding where that exists. I used all the flour that I ground. I want to show you what it looks like when you have the right texture. You see how we've got these nice strands, and it does not stick to my hands. A little bit. You can see there's a couple of pieces that kind of stuck, but it's not glopping onto my hands. So that's the type of texture that you want at the end. This is an example of some kneading of the dough. You can do this by hand and not have a mixer with a dough hook at all. I'm going to weigh the whole batch of dough on my handy kitchen scale so that I will divide it up and weigh each of the loaves. That way I have loaves that are of even size. Otherwise, you don't know what has slightly risen, what is, still too dense, and you cut off what you expect to be the right size, and then they rise all different sizes. So the best way to estimate the size of the loaf is to go by weight. I take it from the total of the bread dough produced. I just use a knife to cut the dough into relatively even pieces, and then I'll sort of fine-tune that with the scale. Once I get each of the loaves to the proper weight, all relatively even, then it's time to shape the loaves to be put into the tins. I kind of roll the dough into a loaf shape and then fold it under. I keep on rolling it, squeezing it with my hands, and rolling the dough so it goes underneath, and then I have a smooth top. And I take my knuckles and just push it down into the pan so that it makes sure that it will fill the corners of the bread pan. My loaves are all ready for the rising process. Now, it's important to cover them with something. Some people use plastic, but it needs to breathe a little bit. You don't want condensation forming on the top of the plastic. So I just cover it with a clean flour sack style tea towel and let it rise. It can rise for about an hour. I can accelerate the rise by putting them in a warm oven. The oven should be like 100 degrees, not more than 120, because then your bread starts to bake. And you don't want to bake now, we just want it to rise. So this oven is approximately 100 degrees. Cover it with a tea towel and let it rise for 30 minutes in that warm space. This was less. This was probably about 20 minutes, and I could see that the dough was doubled in size. It's poofing out of the top. So I'm going to take them out of the oven so I can preheat the oven. It'll finish the rise on the top of the oven while the oven is preheating. Preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. After the oven has preheated, I take the towel off of the bread and then put the bread back into the oven, making sure they are evenly spaced throughout the oven and have enough space between the tins so that air can circulate. We want them baking on all sides, not pushed up against each other so that the heat can't get between the loaves. After 30 minutes, they are done. You can tap on the top of the bread and it should sound hollow. Then you know that it's baked through. 30 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I let it rest for 10 minutes or so. It's still so hot that I have to use oven mitts to handle it. Then I take a knife and make sure I can loosen it from the sides, and it just comes out beautifully. The flour-dusted bread tins are the ticket for having this bread just come right out of the pan, no problem. I often will take a knife and just make sure that we've got loose, because if it grabs when I dump the tin over, it's going to tear the sides of the bread. It smells so good. I'm going to let it cool on the racks until it's cool enough to be put into plastic bags. I do not put it into the plastic bags too hot, or even if it's just slightly warm. It has to come right down to room temperature. Otherwise, you will get condensation inside your bags and your bread will be all wet. They all sound nice and hollow. Beautiful bread. That smells so good. Let's just cut off a slice. There. Ho ho ho. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? Ah. And we just rip it apart and you can dip it in things. It's just good on its own. It doesn't need anything put on it, but you can put different sauces on it and everything. It's beautiful, lovely bread, and I'm going to package it up for the freezer. So I put it into plastic bags, and before I put it in the freezer, I get these big 2-gallon plastic bags, and I usually can get 2 loaves into one of these. Double bagging for the freezer is important because you don't want freezer burn, which is the enemy of baked goods. There we go. We're ready to go to the freezer. And this loaf is going to be for a friend. I usually give away 1 loaf every time I bake 4 loaves because it's a nice gift to give, and it means you're thinking about people, you know, especially during this time. So, if you got some good information from this video, please give me a thumbs up below, and while you're down there, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell so you know when another vegan plant-based recipe is posted. Thank you for watching.